Think for a moment about a quiet pause in your day, a moment when the noise softens, when your hands feel warm around a cup, and your breathing slows just a little. It might be early morning, before the world fully wakes up, or late at night when everything feels heavier and you need something gentle to hold on to. For many people, that moment involves tea, not as a product, not as a ritual written in rules, but as a feeling, a simple, steady presence, a companion during loneliness, reflection, conversation, or rest. You do not need to know anything about tea to feel this connection. You do not need to remember where you first tasted it or who taught you how to brew it. Tea often enters our lives quietly, without ceremony, and stays without asking for attention. It is there when words are difficult. It is there when silence feels right. It is there when time seems to stretch, just enough for us to breathe. But have you ever wondered why? Why does this simple drink carry so much emotional weight across so many cultures? Why does tea appear in moments of grief and celebration, in solitude and togetherness? Why does a leaf placed in hot water feel capable of calming the mind, softening tension, and marking time? Most of us accept tea as something ordinary, something familiar, something small. And yet, beneath that surface simplicity, tea holds a story shaped by human needs, fears, patience, and change. A story not built overnight, not designed by a single mind, but carried forward by countless hands, voices, and lives. When we lift a cup of tea, we rarely think about the long path that brought it there. We do not hear the footsteps of those who walked before us. We do not feel the uncertainty of the first people who trusted its bitterness. We do not see the struggles, the misunderstandings, the slow acceptance that turned a wild leaf into a shared human habit. Tea feels timeless because it has learned how to wait. It waits for water to heat. It waits for leaves to open. It waits for people to sit down. In a world that constantly pushes us to move faster, tea asks us to pause. And perhaps that is why it has survived for so long. Before tea became associated with elegance or refinement, before it appeared in porcelain cups or carefully arranged ceremonies, it existed as something far more fragile. It existed as a question. Is this safe to drink? Is this useful? Is this worth trusting? Every tradition begins as uncertainty. Every comfort begins as an experiment. At some point in human history, someone encountered a leaf that carried both bitterness and warmth. Someone tasted it without knowing what it would do. Someone chose curiosity over fear. That choice did not immediately create culture. It did not instantly bring peace or clarity. It began as something modest, even forgettable, but humans have always returned to the things that helped them endure. Tea did not become important because it was powerful. It became important because it was patient. It did not promise energy like fire or nourishment like grain. It offered something quieter. It offered steadiness. And steadiness in uncertain lives can feel like a form of safety. Across generations, people carried tea with them, not because it demanded attention, but because it earned trust. It became part of daily rhythms, part of conversations that did not need to be recorded, part of moments that felt too small to be remembered, yet too meaningful to be lost. When parents passed tea to children, they were not teaching history. They were teaching pause. They were teaching presence. They were teaching how to share time without filling it with urgency. Tea learned how to fit into human life by listening. It adapted to different climates, different beliefs, different moods. It took on the flavors of the places it traveled. It absorbed the values of the people who welcomed it. In some homes, tea became a symbol of hospitality. In others, a sign of restraint. In others still, a quiet rebellion against chaos. But always, tea remained close to the ground, close to the body, close to the body, close to the breath. That closeness matters. Human history is often told through grand movements, through wars, inventions, leaders, and borders. But beneath those loud stories are softer ones woven into daily survival. Tea belongs to those softer stories. It belongs to moments that did not make headlines, to hands that trembled from cold or exhaustion, to voices that lowered when the world felt too sharp. When people felt overwhelmed, tea offered something predictable. When days felt endless, tea marked time without pressure. When conversations felt dangerous, tea gave them a reason to begin gently. This is not because tea changed people, it is because people changed tea. They turned it into a language, a signal, a pause that could be shared without explanation. And yet, this deep familiarity often hides how unlikely tea's journey truly was. It did not arrive fully formed. It did not immediately bring comfort. It had to be learned, tolerated, questioned, and shaped. There was a time when tea was unknown, a time when its bitterness felt strange, a time when its effects were misunderstood. There was a time when people lived without it. Imagining that world requires stepping away from modern expectations. It requires remembering that for most of human existence, clean water was uncertain, daily fatigue was constant, and survival demanded attention. In such a world, even a small change mattered. Tea did not begin as pleasure. It began as response, a response to tired bodies, a response to harsh environments, a response to the need for something that could be trusted day after day. The first people who encountered tea did not know what it would become. They did not imagine global traditions or cultural identity. They simply tried to make life a little more bearable. That is how most enduring human practices begin, not with ambition, but with necessity. As we sit here now, holding a cup that feels familiar, it is easy to forget how many lives shaped that moment, how many times tea was rejected before it was accepted, how many quiet choices allowed it to remain. Tea's history is not just about where it came from, it is about why people kept returning to it, why they shared it, why they defended it, why they carried it across borders, even when doing so was dangerous or forbidden. Those answers do not lie in dates or rulers. They lie in hunger, exhaustion, curiosity, and patience. They lie in the human desire to make meaning from repetition, to find comfort in routine, to slow the passing of time just enough to feel alive within it. This is the story hidden inside a cup of tea. Not a story of leaves alone, but of people who needed something steady when the world was not. People who learned that sometimes survival is not about strength, but about softness. And like all quiet companions, tea waited for humanity to be ready. Its journey did not begin in grand halls or formal ceremonies. It began in ordinary lives, shaped by ordinary needs, in a world that had not yet learned how to listen to small comforts. That is where our story truly begins. Before tea existed in human life, daily survival followed a harsher rhythm. Water was not always safe. Food demanded long hours of labor. Fatigue was not something to be solved, only endured. People rose with the sun and rested when darkness forced them to stop. Between those two moments, there was little space for comfort. The body worked until it could not, and the mind learned to accept exhaustion as normal. In such a world, small discoveries carried enormous weight. Long before tea became a drink meant for reflection or calm, it emerged from a need far more practical. People needed warmth. They needed something to make water safer to drink. They needed something that helped the body endure long days without collapse. The act of boiling water itself was already a step forward in human survival. Heat made water cleaner, easier to trust. But boiled water alone offered no taste, no comfort, no reason to linger. At some point, leaves entered that water, not with ceremony, not with intention to create tradition, simply because humans have always experimented with what grows around them. In forests and hills, people learned which plants healed and which harmed. They chewed leaves, brewed roots, tested bark. They paid attention to how the body reacted. Some plants eased pain. Some sharpened focus. Some brought calm. Others brought sickness or death. Knowledge was built slowly, passed through memory and warning rather than writing. Among countless plants, one leaf stood out. It was bitter, but not poisonous. It carried warmth, but not heaviness. It sharpened the mind without overwhelming the body. At first, this leaf was not special. It was simply tolerated. People drank it not because it tasted good, but because it helped. It helped them stay awake during long hours of work. It helped them stay awake during long hours of work. It helped them feel warmer in damp or cold environments. It helped them trust the water they drank. This was tea before it was tea. A tool, not a pleasure. The earliest drinkers did not gather to discuss flavor or aroma. They drank while working. They drank while traveling. They drank while traveling. They drank because it fit into lives already full of effort. There was no separation between medicine and nourishment. Anything that supported the body belonged to survival. Tea earned its place quietly. It did not replace food. It did not replace rest. But it softened the edges of fatigue. It made endurance feel slightly more possible. That mattered. As people began to notice how the leaf affected them, patterns formed. They learned how much to use. They learned when it helped most. They learned who benefited and who did not. Slowly, knowledge turned into habit. Habit turned into routine. Routine turned into culture. But this process took generations. Tea did not spread because someone declared it valuable. It spread because people shared what worked. A traveler offered it to another traveler. A worker passed it to a companion. A healer brewed it for someone too weak to eat. Each act was small. Together they carried tea beyond its birthplace. As trade routes formed and communities interacted, tea traveled with them, not as an export, as a personal practice. People carried dried leaves because they were light, because they lasted, because they turned unfamiliar water into something safer. In this way, tea followed human movement rather than leading it. It crossed mountains, valleys, and borders without announcement. It entered new regions quietly, often misunderstood at first. In some places, its bitterness caused suspicion. In others, its effects were questioned. Was it truly helpful or merely habit? Was it medicine or indulgence? These questions did not have clear answers. Tea existed in a space between necessity and choice. That ambiguity shaped its early identity. It was not sacred. It was not forbidden. It was simply there. People adapted it to their own lives. They mixed it with local herbs. They changed how it was prepared. They drank it at different times for different reasons. There was no single way to drink tea. There still isn't. As tea spread, it began to gather meaning, not imposed meaning, but lived meaning. In quiet moments, people noticed that tea invited pause, not because it demanded it, but because preparing it took time. Water needed to heat, leaves needed to steep, hands needed to wait. In a world where most tasks required constant motion, this waiting felt unusual. Some embraced it, others ignored it, but those who noticed began to associate tea with a different pace of life. This was not intentional philosophy, it was observation. Over time, tea became linked to moments when work stopped, even briefly, moments when people sat instead of stood, moments when attention shifted inward. These moments were rare enough to feel meaningful. Still, tea remained practical at its core. It was not yet a symbol of refinement or social status. It belonged to farmers, travelers, monks, and laborers, people whose lives demanded resilience. For them, tea was not about escape. It was about balance. Too much rest meant hunger. Too much work meant collapse. Tea helped hold the line between the two. As communities grew and knowledge deepened, people began to refine tea preparation. They learned how drying changed flavor, how timing altered strength, how different leaves produced different effects. This refinement did not remove tea from ordinary life. It deepened its relationship with it. Tea became something people paid attention to. Attention changed everything. When people pay attention to something, they begin to care about it. When they care, they protect it. When they protect it, they pass it on. Tea's survival depended on this slow accumulation of care. By the time tea reached beyond its original landscape, it was no longer just a leaf. It was a practice shaped by countless small decisions. How much to use, who to share it with, when to drink it. Each choice carried meaning, even if no one named it. Tea became familiar, but never trivial. And yet, as tea moved further into the world, it encountered societies with different beliefs, different fears, and different ideas about the body and the mind. What one culture accepted easily, another questioned deeply. What one saw as helpful, another saw as suspicious. Tea was about to face resistance, not because it failed, but because anything that alters daily life, even gently, invites scrutiny. The leaf that once quietly supported survival would soon be pulled into debates about morality, discipline, and control. Its role would change. Its meaning would shift. Its presence would no longer be neutral. Tea had survived by being useful. Now it would have to survive being noticed. As tea became more visible in human life, it stopped being just a quiet helper. Once something spreads beyond its place of origin, it begins to reflect the fears and values of the societies it enters. Tea was no longer merely tolerated. It was discussed, judged, questioned, and with attention came tension. In many communities, anything that altered the body or mind attracted suspicion. People asked whether tea encouraged discipline or distraction, whether it strengthened the spirit or weakened it, whether it supported order or subtly undermined it. These questions did not arise because tea was dangerous. They arose because tea was influential. A drink that affected alertness, focus, and calm could not remain invisible for long. Some religious thinkers worried that tea encouraged too much comfort. Others feared it interfered with established fasting traditions or spiritual discipline. There were debates over whether tea sharpened devotion or dulled it. At the same time, tea began to move upward through society. What had once belonged to laborers and travelers started appearing in places of learning, contemplation, and authority. Scholars drank it while studying. Monks used it to stay awake during long periods of meditation. Officials relied on it during extended hours of administration. This shift changed how tea was perceived. When ordinary people drank tea, it was survival. When influential people drank tea, it became identity. Tea started to symbolize control over the body rather than indulgence, alertness rather than intoxication, restraint rather than excess. In societies where alcohol had long been the dominant social drink, tea stood apart. It did not loosen speech. It did not cloud judgment. It did not lead to disorder. For some, this made tea appealing. For others, it made tea threatening. Power often fears what it cannot easily categorize. Tea sat in an uncomfortable space. It was stimulating but not intoxicating, calming but not sedating, social but not disruptive. Because of this, authorities struggled to decide what tea represented. In certain places, tea houses emerged as new social spaces. People gathered not to drink heavily, but to talk, listen, and observe. Conversation flourished. Ideas moved freely. Social boundaries softened. This worried those who relied on rigid hierarchy. When people sit together as equals, even briefly, power feels less stable. Tea houses became places of exchange. Stories, opinions, and criticisms flowed more easily when minds were alert and bodies at ease. As a result, tea was sometimes viewed not as a drink, but as a catalyst. In response, there were moments of restriction and control, rules about who could drink tea, rules about where it could be served, rules about how it should be consumed. These were not always written laws. Often, they were social pressures, moral judgments, or institutional discouragement. Tea itself did not rebel. People projected rebellion onto it. At the same time, tea became entangled with trade and power. As demand grew, tea was no longer just a local practice. It became a commodity. Leaves were measured, routes were established. Control over production and distribution mattered. Where tea went, influence followed. This transformation changed tea's relationship with those who had nurtured it quietly for generations. What had once been shared freely now carried value. What had once been personal now became strategic. Tea connected distant regions, but it also created imbalance. Some societies found themselves defined by tea production. Their landscapes reshaped to meet demand. Others became dependent on its import, tying their daily comfort to global systems beyond their control. Tea was no longer neutral. It became part of negotiations, taxes, and political leverage. In some cases, resistance formed not against tea itself, but against what tea represented: control, dependency, unequal exchange. Refusing tea became a statement. Accepting tea became a compromise. Yet even during periods of conflict, tea never disappeared from daily life entirely. People adapted. When tea was restricted, they found ways to prepare it privately. When it was taxed, they reduced portions but kept the habit. When it was criticized, they reframed its purpose. Tea endured because it had already embedded itself into routine. You can remove luxury without pain. You cannot easily remove comfort once it becomes part of survival. Over time, tea's meaning shifted again. It began to symbolize refinement and self-control, not through force, but through repetition. The careful preparation of tea became a way to express patience. The simplicity of its ingredients became a sign of restraint. The quietness of its consumption became a marker of civility. In some cultures, tea was elevated into ritual, not to separate it from daily life, but to protect its essence. Ritual slowed consumption. It demanded attention. It reminded people that not everything needed to be rushed. This was tea's transformation, from necessity to choice, from habit to meaning. But this elevation also created distance. Tea was no longer equally accessible. It was presented as something to be learned, mastered, performed correctly. This excluded some while impressing others. Still, tea continued to exist on both levels at once. It remained in simple cups in quiet homes. It also appeared in formal settings, surrounded by rules and expectations. Few things in human culture managed to live in both spaces simultaneously. Tea did. By the time tea reached the modern era, it had survived suspicion, control, conflict, and transformation. It had been questioned by religion. It had been regulated by power. It had been reshaped by trade. And yet, when people felt overwhelmed, they still reached for it. Not because of politics, not because of status, but because of memory. Memory of how tea made the body feel. Memory of how it softened time. The world was changing rapidly now. Industrialization accelerated life. Cities grew louder. Time became measured more strictly. Tea faced a new challenge. Not rejection, but replacement. Could a quiet drink survive in a world that valued speed? The answer would redefine tea once again. The modern world did not arrive gently. It arrived with noise, speed, and pressure. Time, once guided by sunlight and exhaustion, became divided into minutes and seconds. Work no longer ended when the body demanded rest. It ended when the clock allowed it. In this new rhythm, many old practices struggled to survive. Anything slow was questioned. Anything quiet was at risk of being forgotten. Tea entered this world carrying centuries of memory. At first, it adapted. Tea became easier to prepare. Leaves were processed, packaged, standardized. What once required attention could now be done quickly. This made tea more accessible than ever before. It reached homes that had never known it. It crossed oceans and languages with ease. But something subtle shifted. Tea was no longer only about waiting. It became something you could drink while doing something else. And yet, even as convenience changed its form, tea retained a certain presence. Unlike many modern stimulants, tea did not demand urgency. It did not push the body aggressively. It did not insist on constant motion. In offices, factories, and schools, tea breaks appeared not as indulgence, but as necessity, a brief pause, a moment to step away. People may not have called it reflection, but that is what it was. Even when rushed, tea still asked for a little time. As societies modernized, tea took on new meanings. In some places, it became tied to national identity. In others, it represented continuity in the face of change. Immigrants carried tea with them as a piece of home. Families held on to tea rituals as proof that not everything had been lost. When language failed, tea remained familiar. In moments of cultural displacement, tea offered something stable, a taste that did not change, a process that could be repeated anywhere. Modern life also brought new questions. Was tea still meaningful when consumed without attention? Did its value diminish when stripped of ritual? Could something so old remain relevant in a world obsessed with novelty? The answer was not found in arguments or movements, it was found in behavior. People continued to reach for tea, not always consciously, not always thoughtfully, but consistently. In times of stress, tea remained a default choice. In moments of illness, recovery, or emotional exhaustion, tea appeared again. This persistence says something important. Tea does not compete. It does not advertise itself aggressively. It does not demand loyalty. It simply waits. In recent years, as the pace of life has become increasingly overwhelming, tea has quietly returned to deeper relevance. People speak of mindfulness, of slowing down, of reclaiming attention. Tea does not need to be reinvented to serve these desires. It has always existed there. When someone chooses tea over something faster or stronger, they're often making a decision they cannot fully explain. It feels instinctive. That instinct is memory, even if we do not recognize it as such. Memory not of a specific past, but of a human pattern, of how people have always sought balance rather than excess, of how calm has always required effort. Tea reminds us that not everything valuable is intense. In a culture that celebrates productivity, tea offers presence. In a world that rewards speed, tea offers patience. In a society that values constant output, tea allows quiet. This does not mean tea is superior. It means tea is different. And difference matters. Modern debates around tea often focus on health, sustainability, or authenticity. These discussions are important, but they are secondary. The deeper reason tea continues to matter is not scientific or economic. It is relational. Tea creates a space between people, a space that is not rushed, a space that does not require entertainment. Two people sitting with tea do not need to fill the silence immediately. The cup itself gives permission to wait. In this way, tea still shapes human interaction. It teaches listening. It encourages restraint. It allows conversation to unfold rather than perform. Even when consumed alone, tea marks a boundary between work and rest, between thought and action. It tells the body for just a moment that it is allowed to stop. This may seem small, but human history is built on small permissions: the permission to pause, the permission to care, the permission to exist without justification. Tea has never promised transformation, it offers something quieter: continuity. From its earliest days as a tolerated leaf to its place in modern life, tea has followed humanity without trying to lead it. It has changed shape, meaning, and form, but it has never abandoned its core role: to support, to soften, to steady. When we drink tea today, we are not participating in history consciously. We are participating in a pattern of choosing something gentle in a harsh world, a pattern of allowing ourselves to feel time instead of fighting it. The story of tea is not about leaves or cups. It is about how humans learn to care for themselves and each other in quiet ways. It shows us that survival is not only about strength, it is also about tenderness. Tea does not shout this lesson. It does not demand recognition. It simply waits, as it always has, for someone to sit down. And perhaps that is why tea endures, not because it changed the world, but because it helped people live in it. If this story made you pause, even briefly, then tea has done what it has always done best. You are welcome to sit with that feeling for a moment longer.